We are all back. We're all seated. Our minds are ready to receive more information. And our lovely co host to the side is ready to join. So I'm going to give him his accolades and introduction. We have Dr. Alex Gill, who is a senior lecturer and associate research faculty of digital humanities in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Yale University, where he teaches introductory and advanced courses in digital humanities and runs project-based learning and collective research initiatives. Before joining Yale, Alex served for 10 years as a digital scholarship librarian at Columbia University. His research interests include Caribbean culture, history, digital humanities, and technology design for different infrastructural and socioeconomic environments, and the ownership of material extent of the cultural and scholarly record. Over the past decade, he has been a prolific producer and contributing team member of many recognized digital humanities projects and scholarly software, including Torn Apart or Separados, In the Same Boats and Wax. His scholarly articles have appeared in several essay collections and are referred and refereed journals around the world, including Guinness and the Canadian Review of Comparative Literature. Let's see, he goes on to a second page. It's not. It means that your excitement is good for what we have listed here. His forthcoming edition and translation of the lost original version of And the Dogs Were Silent is forthcoming from Duke Press. He is currently senior editor of Archipelago's Journal, editor of the Internationalization of Digital Humanities Quarterly, and co-organizer of the Caribbean Digital Annual Conference and the co-principal investigator of the Caribbean Digital Scholarship Collective. His lecture today is entitled Minimal Computing and AI for Caribbean Cultural Heritage, More Questions Than Answers. Welcome.
All right. Thank you. I'm honored to be here talking with such a distinguished crowd. Let me start with the normal apologies. Like the subtitle says, I really came here with more questions than answers. So this is rare for me. I usually show up in a place and have all the answers. And not this time, and it's because of the strange world that we are being asked to participate in, brought about by artificial intelligence. I warned Amalia when she invited me that I don't see it clearly yet. There's one thing, though, that I do see clearly, and that is that nobody else does see it clearly. The talk today is going to be divided into three parts. I added one, listening to your conversation this morning during coffee and listening to Stanley. Now, the first part is going to be focused on minimal computing, which is a concept and practice that we developed over the years that was born in the Caribbean. I myself am from the Dominican Republic. I grew up, and I was born in 1973. I grew up listening to baseball on transistor radios operated by batteries, listening to the games under candlelight because there was no electricity in the evening. So I grew up in a world very similar to the ones that the olds probably grew up here in the room. The young ones have it easy. They don't know. They don't know. So we are going to look at some of the technologies that were developed with that background in mind in the minimal computing section. In the second section, I'm going to be asking the question, who owns black data? In this particular case, the word black there is signaling the black diaspora in the Americas. And who owns that data today? It's very important as we transition to the final questions around AI. Some of those themes have already come up. Who Owns Black Data is the name of a conference series that we have been organizing in the United States by a group of mostly black folks and me for the past, 3 or 4 years. Now, I'm going to conclude by talking about AI. So mostly opening questions for us to reflect on together. In the question and answer, I want to hear from you. Once I open up these questions, I want to know how you are answering them for yourself so that we can think together about these things. Now, let me begin with minimal computing. I agree 100% with everything that Stanley said. Stanley outlined for all of us this morning a series of goals, and I agree with these goals. I'll list a few. There were many, but it's how do we pursue a Caribbean archive that is Caribbean? Implied in that goal is the goal of achieving data sovereignty, which came up with it. We don't want firewalls. We want our data and our software, by implication, to be ours. How do we bridge the gap between the idea of memory embedded into the institution of archives that we inherit from colonial powers with the ways in which communities have done the work of memory outside of writing cultures? That's the goal. And it is a valuable one if we are to make the National Archive be a combination of those two things, right? Or a third thing that comes out of there, some kind of synthesis of the two that is born out of them, right? So these are the goals. Stanley, he laid out others. These are the main ones I'm going to latch onto. My talk is going to focus on the practical side. He's a theory guy. I'm the guy you bring in then to like make the theory a reality. So everything I'm going to be talking about is going to sound speculative, but it has a practical component. The way I've gone around building things, making dreams come true around the Caribbean and around the world has always been based on the practice of speculation, the practice of freedom dreaming, as a colleague in the United States calls it, the practice of surrealism, which is the poetry that I love to read. The Caribbean surrealism of Aimé Césaire or René Despestre is what nourishes me. But don't forget, I am talking about practical things. I'm going to talk about money. I'm going to talk about engineers. I'm going to talk about the lack of human resources. I'm going to talk about all these things between the lines. So let's start with the dream of Caribbean architectures. The fundamental question of minimal computing was, as I formulated it in 2014, what do we really need? I saw growing up, I got a PhD at the University of Virginia in the early decade of the century. And this is when I started my journey in digital humanities. Absolutely all the other colleagues that were getting a PhD with me had access to these amazing databases. Absolutely, the Europeans and the Americans had gone to town. So there was Mark Twain database, there was the Shakespeare database, there were all these databases. There wasn't a Caribbean database for the kind of work that I wanted to do in Caribbean literature in the 20th century. Now, around that time, the Digital Library of the Caribbean were beginning the conversations unbeknownst to me in Florida. So we didn't even have DLUC back in those days. There were small operations that had come to the Caribbean, expropriated the materials, put them behind firewalls, and those were being handled out of Europe, Belgium, Spain, the United States. Several of them, we can name them by name, but no need to shame them. We know who they are. And I didn't have access to those. So I said, okay, my life is going to be this. I'm going to be working on trying to build a world in which a student like me in the middle of nowhere can have access to these things. This is very different than the question of local access, which is one of the goals that Stanley rightly points out should be a priority. I'm the diaspora kid, the kid who left home to pursue opportunities elsewhere. And I too wanted a piece of home with me where I went. So how do we go about building these things? To me seemed like an important question to ask when I knew that we didn't have the money to do it. Now, the first time I approached the University of Virginia libraries to build a database of Caribbean literature in the 20th century, they told me, oh yeah, that's $5 million and 10 years of your life. And I said, well, it can't be. We don't have that kind of money lying around. How are we going to do this? I started traveling around the Caribbean, seeing how people were trying to address these issues about 20 years ago. And what I saw, and I still see, is that Caribbean folks in the cultural heritage sector and in universities were mostly imitating the standards being set by Americans and Europeans, despite the fact that we were writing so many articles and books about neocolonial this, decolonization that, anti-colonial this and that. When it came time to negotiate these deals with software companies, we were super happy to just let them dictate the terms under which we build these databases. How is the metadata going to be done? We're going to do it with the Dublin standard. That's Dublin, Ohio. That's not even Dublin, Ireland. Which, like, just to be clear, what is a standard? What is the metadata standard? It's just a bunch of people in a room, probably smaller than this, usually white. They sit around and they decide, okay, so this is the author. Objects have authors. This is the title. Objects have titles. And they make these decisions based on their own cultural heritage, and then these decisions are supposed to be universal. And this is the way that I saw everybody acting in the Caribbean 20 years ago, as if this universality really applied. There were a couple of voices, sure, back then, who would say, wait, why are we adopting these metadata standards? Why are we doing it this way? But for the most part, I saw many people making really bad deals. And deals that ultimately turned out to be really expensive. Because they weren't considering, because of a lack of understanding of the technology, to put it bluntly, they weren't considering the maintenance costs down the line. They weren't considering the engineering costs in order to get the projects going, et cetera. Many reasons. And I diagnosed that the problem there was that we were imitating. It is the same old problem that was diagnosed by the anti-colonial thinkers of the 20th century, that we were assimilating and imitating, and that we just assumed that the best tech and the best ways of knowing things come from Europe and the United States. We were going against our own traditions of like just figuring out how to solve problems locally. Now, it was in 2005 or 6 that I went to Cuba. I think it was my second time in Cuba that I learned about an architect there called Ernesto Orosa. Ernesto Orosa had spent the 1990s going around the island of Cuba, documenting the ways that people were finding technological solutions to their local problems during what is called by historians the special period. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the Cubans went into a really tough period where they had no money, no subsidies. They had become too dependent on the Soviets. So that did not stop the Cuban folks from going around trying to solve problems. One of my favorite stories from that Ernesto Rosa recounts in one of his books is of the lack of antennas. Just to give you a quick example. So there were no antennas. So people had TVs, but there were no antennas. So people weren't getting good signal on their televisions. Until one intrepid Cuban realized one day that at the comedores, which is the places where people go eat their lunch, where the workers go eat their lunch, the trays that they were served the food on were made of aluminum. And so he put on his X-ray lenses and he said, wait, this is not only a tray, this is aluminum. And this intrepid Cuban then put that aluminum tray, couple of them, on top of his house. And nobody knows how this happened, but 1 week later, everybody in Cuba had aluminum trays. Now, this example should sound familiar to anybody who grew up in the Caribbean. This is the way that our mothers know how to make, how to use a Coca-Cola bottle in so many ways that don't involve drinking the liquid inside. This is a Caribbean ingenuity that I dare say, and if there's any historian in the room, please correct me, goes back centuries. This is traditions of ingenuity that come from Africa, that come in the 19th century from the South Asian migrations to the region. These are people who learned how to make do with what they had around and who had those X-ray glasses who could see the reality of things. So Ernesto Rosa developed a whole theory around a very fascinating theory against communism and against capitalism. He criticized both at the same time, the socialist societies and the capitalist societies, by pointing out that they are societies of the finished product and the single use. He said that these are societies that build in factories many products, both, and that both tell you this product should be used this way. This tray, this aluminum tray, should be used as a tray in a cafeteria. And he said the Caribbean people, though, have the capacity to see beyond the single use, beyond the prescribed use. So they tell you, use this way. And Caribbean people say, okay, but I can also be used this other way and this other way. They see the material reality in front of them in very special ways. These special ways in which we can see material realities apparently were outside the room when we were making deals 20 years ago with these database companies. So how do we bring that kind of seeing the world, that kind of seeing our reality around us, of making do with what we have, to the building of these databases? And I'm going to be focusing on the digital side for the rest of my talk, but please feel free to apply to problems like the lack of training in human resources for conservation, because some of these things go beyond the digital. Now, the slide here, the photo in the background is a photo that Ernesto Rosa uses a lot to tell one story that I find particularly illuminating here. It's the story of a young couple that fell in love and didn't have much money and to buy a new house, so they wanted to build a second floor on their mother's house of the groom. But the urban codes in Cuba, developed under colonialism and continued under capitalism and communism, prescribed that a house that was a two-floor house should pay more taxes, but defined a second floor as being completed once the stair to the second floor was finished. I love this story. So what did the young couple do in order to be able to build their house and not have to pay extra taxes? Well, they built the stair but left the last step unbuilt. So when they go to their house, they just... And that little hub, that little gap, allowed them to continue living there happily ever after, as marriages do, without having to pay extra taxes. And the only thing they needed to do was a little extra hub, which I'm sure is good for exercise. You know, it's like, yeah. So this little story, the story of minimal computing is the story of that unfinished step. It's the story of that which we are willing to live without. So when we ask the question, what do we really need? We are asking the question, what step are we ready to live out? How do we live a little bit lower or differently? Could be considered higher than the standards imposed. They're not even imposed. They're just suggested by the Europeans and the Americans. Something to think about. What is your missing step so that you can get to the second floor and not pay taxes? That is what this couple thought about. That is what many Caribbean folks do every day. Think about what are the real necessities here. Now, he called this kind of architectures that grow out of these necessities completely in contrast to the ones prescribed by the urban codes inherited from colonialism as architectures of necessity. And he uses it to describe the whole built environment of the Caribbean, in Cuba and Barbados. We look at the buildings, so you drive any road around here, and you will see these architectures of necessity. They're not necessarily the dreams of the urban codes. They are a reflection of how people reacted to those codes. So when we go about dreaming of digitization and the databases for our cultural heritage, yes, the urban codes here are these kind of international standards and prescriptions and softwares that are being developed in the United States and Europe and China too, I should say now. And whether we want to or not, what we will end up building, if we are to build it ourselves, instead of making a fool's agreement, it's going to be by nature an architecture of necessity. Just so that you don't think that I'm just telling pretty stories, I have built some of this software that is Caribbean based in its thinking and in its use. And it's actually happy to report that it's being used in the Caribbean by thousands of group. I know from the logs on GitHub, which is where the software, at least one of my softwares exists. The one I'm talking about is called Wax, and it's used everywhere. It's definitely used in Create Caribbean for most of the things that they do. There's a Create Caribbean right there in the back. Now, in this software, was created with 2G in mind. So I'm not thinking of 3G or 4G. When I go to Dominican Republic, when I go home, I still have to buy cards. I don't know how it's done in Barbados, but I still have to buy cards that have a limited amount of data. So if I put a SIM card on my phone, I have to get like 1 gigabyte of data, and that has a price, right? So people have limited bandwidth. The software is built to work really nicely in 2G. The software also works without internet, and that's important. It's not only about preserving the environment. It's not only about doing things cheaply. It's also understanding that we don't have electricity in the Caribbean all the time, and that not everybody in rural communities has access to the internet. And some of the work that we do, especially in community archives, needs to circulate. I learned this from Cuba, so it's perfectly fine to circulate a whole archive with 10,000 items on a USB card. And Cubans were doing this when they were passing to each other pirated movies and games in a thing called El Paquete already like 20 years ago. It's a whole different environment there. I learned so much there. People, because of censorship, it wasn't only the infrastructure, it was also the political infrastructure. So it's a socio-technical problem. They have problems with censorship, still do. So people that were doing LGBTQ work or Black studies work, for example, had journals that didn't publish on paper, didn't publish on the internet on open access. They actually published on email chains of trusted people. So every number would come out in an email. Every time people would come out from the outside, they say, can you download all these things on JSTOR and put them on a USB? And then when I would go to Cuba, I would bring a USB. I imagine next time I go, I probably still do the same. Bring a USB full of essays and articles and ebooks in a USB. People throw a party, a soup, some rum, and then everybody brings their own computers. That's a very different infrastructure than the one that the urban codes of the United States and the European things imagine. They imagine a world that everything exists on the internet. So we say, speak of digitization, they just take for granted that these things will exist on the internet on a website. Why are we taking this for granted? It doesn't have to be taken for granted. They assume that people want the high resolution image of everything in the world, and then what happens to people with 2G? You have to wait there forever to download the thing. This software built around all of those problems and all of those issues. And it's being used, and it's being used by institutions. I've done several other little pieces of software that are not as used as that one, but the idea has always been the same, which is that it is possible to build our own solutions. In fact, I studied poetry. I built this thing. If a guy who studies poetry can build these things, we can build these things. And this is a message that I carry with me to the Caribbean, which is that the reason we don't have more people building these things is because we're not giving the opportunity for people to, or the space and time for people to learn these things. And this is one of the things I like about Create Caribbean, creating a space. They're even teaching kids in a summer school. We were just talking about that. You in the room never learned these things because either you thought that math was too hard and you believed that any of this involved math. It doesn't. You didn't find time or kept postponing it or kept hoping somebody else would do it. I saw it in my generation. So many people who have done so much damage in this world, in the good sense, if they had taken the time to learn, didn't learn. I took the time to learn because we do need people to learn. Not everybody in the room needs to learn, but a good percentage of us needs to learn how to do the tech side of the house. I'll come back to this part on the AI question because it does complicate things a little bit. That's minimal computing. I'll pause there, drink a little water while you reflect on this idea that we can build minimally. Sorry, I didn't explain the minimal part of it. The minimal part is that it does coincide, this kind of computation, call it Caribbean, but it applies to any place that has limited infrastructure compared to the so-called standard, is that it ends up being smaller. The software is smaller. The size of the things are smaller. The amount of computation that is needed in order to preserve them is smaller. This has positive impact on the environment because if we build things a particular way, we can actually turn off the computers once in a while. Don't let the computers keep running more water out of our ecosystems, more electricity that we cannot renew. Now, in a world where solar panels have come to dominate, they keep promising this is going to happen. Sure, we can go maximalist, but for now, in the Caribbean, who will suffer harsher consequences for environmental degradation than most regions of the planet, probably we want to compute less. At a very practical level, just in case there's an engineer in the room, this is done by actually eliminating the database in its technical sense and replacing it with static assets. We don't need to reconstruct. In case you didn't know, all of these databases, you look up an image, they're reconstructing that image for you and that page every time you ask for it. So there's new computation happening every time somebody searches for something. The way that I build my software, that computation has already been done and doesn't have to be done again. When somebody tries to find an article or an artifact, they get it, the same article that was there 3 years ago, without having it to be reconstructed. Most of the internet right now is being built this way, dynamically, to be reconstructed on the fly. Most of the internet doesn't exist before you call it. It's constant computation, constant resources being drained out of our rivers and our forests. Who wants black data? So that's another problem we have. That's a problem we've had in the Caribbean. Let me just put it to you bluntly. It's white people who own black data for the most part. I'm just giving you an example. Ancestry.com. Ancestry, the Mormons spent decades going around small municipal libraries, small little city libraries and stuff like this, helping with the digitization, just so they can get the marriage records, death records, and stuff like that, so they can feed they had their ideological reasons for doing this. But unbeknownst to them, what they were feeding was the future of $1 billions industry. They were recently bought by Blackstone. I don't know if any of you know Blackstone Corporation for $3.5 billion. Now, Blackstone Corporation is a major contributor to the Republican Party in the United States. Their politics are basically deregulation, black people second-class citizens. You know, your typical, Republican nonsense of white supremacy in the real sense, not the way the young people use it to describe everything these days. As in, the white people are the sovereigns, and everybody else works for them. It is basically the politics of these people. It's the politics of the company that ended up with the data that is now desired by everybody. Exacerbating the problem is that in the 21st century, there's a renewed hunger by black people to reconstruct their ancestry. For historical reasons, the fact that the generation that came right before me trained a bunch of young people to care about their past in the 19th century, 18th century, to try to reconstruct that which had been fragmented, silenced. These broken archives then became the site of an unsatisfiable desire to reconstruct a past with the same kind of certainty that we saw white people had. Because of the good job that the Mormons had done and others, we saw these family trees that white people were able to create that go back flawlessly to the 16th and 15th century, and young people wanted that. And now that problem is coming to a head because that desire is widespread, not only in the United States, I see it in Caribbean society too. The desire to be able to reconnect to your ancestors is now different than the way that was practiced in African societies before the slave trade, and continues to be practiced in some communities. Because there is a big difference between connecting to your ancestors through religious practices and cultural practices of memory, and trying to reconstruct your ancestry by having a computer spit out a family tree. Now, this is going to come up again in the AI section, but one of the things that these companies are doing now is selling consumers AI reconstructions of their ancestors. So this is one of the things that there's a company in San Francisco, for example, who uses as part of their data sets is slave advertisements. And it's this particular fintech company is owned by a black guy who really is doing it out of good intentions, he put aside 10 of his engineers to work on this problem, to try to connect all of this data from ancestry of marriage records, death records, with the slave adverts and all kinds of other data sets in order to be able to use AI and try to give you a sense of who your ancestors were. Except, of course, it's AI. I mean, I don't know if you heard. But AI is like that kid Pepe in my neighborhood who, when he didn't know something, he'd just make it up. Who Wants Black Data is the name that we gave to our conference series. We're meeting next week in New Orleans at the Amistad Research Center, which is the largest archive of Black African American and Black diaspora materials in the United States. Kathy Hendrick is the director. We're meeting there. We've been meeting for three consecutive years. First one at Morgan State University, Historical Black College, Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and then at Yale University last year, and this year at the Amistad. And we're bringing together archivists, technologists, and scholars to have the conversation of ownership of the data. I'll tell you some of the things that have come out of that conference series for us to think with. Most people, community archives, institutional archivists, scholars, and Black technologists mostly agree with Stanley. It's like, interestingly enough, the conversations always lean away from a model of ownership towards a model of stewardship, which I think it's, I'm not gonna lie, I think it's just cute. As a few of us in the organizing committee and active in the conversation say that, yes, that's fine, but sadly we live under international capitalism right now, and ownership cannot be left out of the equation. Even as we can think with both, we can think both as stewardship as a cultural phenomena, but we have to understand the strictures of ownership as it is used in the world today in a business sense. To that regard, we are working on several outcomes that are practical, because I'm a practical guy. I'll tell you a couple of them that might be of interest to this room. One is a database of Black data sets prior to emancipation. of existing digitized materials, but it's not only documents. Sometimes data sets can be, for example, numbers, as is, for example, the database slavevoyages.org, which is used by historians everywhere. It has documents, but it's mostly extracting the information from the documents to create the database that has become so useful to historians of the slavery period. So let me tell you a little bit of the first archivist and librarian at Howard University. She thought, like I do, that these metadata standards that she was trained on were insufficient. When she was hired at Howard University, I can't remember her name right now, I'm blanking. When she was hired at Howard University in the 50s, I want to say, she noticed that metadata didn't capture race. When I was working as an archivist and a librarian at Howard, it was important for her to separate the black authors. So she started adding the category of race to the metadata standard that she designed at Howard. Now we're doing the same with this database. We're creating a database of all of these things, and we are adding several new metadata categories that are just simply not there in the archival world. Race, ownership, stewardship. Who owns it? What is the finances here? Where are they coming? Who are they benefiting? So in race, for example, we don't use white, black. We say majority white, majority black. Think mixed, if we see it's a mix of things. But everything gets researched to more or less understand the demographics of ownership because they're important. The demographics of ownership are important because the stories you tell out of your data sets never come as just these pristine things without narrative, without stories. Data sets, including the one at slavevoyages.org, come wrapped up in narrative. And the data is presented a particular way. The categories themselves are designed a particular way. In some cases, the engineers make the decision without any training in theory or history. The way we categorize data tells a story. Now, majority black-owned data sets usually tell a story a different way. This is the case for making Caribbean archives Caribbean, which is that we would tell a different story. The data would serve a different purpose. The second thing we're building that I think might be of interest to this group is a black data license. It's just a prototype, just first one that will have provisos. We're working with the legal team. Some of the most brilliant black legal minds in the United States are helping us with this one, so that we can create a license that can mitigate some of the theft. That would at least give us an instrument to fight in court when an AI company takes a data set without being asked. A black data license is just the beginning of many things you can think about. Legal recourses and business recourses that you can do, that we can use, we can develop, design to protect our assets. And I call it assets because they're called assets at Beinecke Archive, for example. They speak in terms of business at the very top. Definitely all white. These are our assets, and we must protect them within the legal system that we inhabit. Just two things that are coming out of this world. We can think of many others together. 3, AI. This is where I just have questions. The same software that I built to work in the Caribbean for Caribbean cultural collections, WAX, I built in 2 hours using Claude Code, sitting watching a Netflix show a couple of weeks ago. Same software. I gave it more or less the documentation for the original, and I said, I want to make sure this works in infrastructure in the Caribbean, can work without electricity, can work without internet. I want to make sure that it's built this way, blah, blah, blah. That's all. I wrote a little thing, like a 1-page, 2-page thing, and I continued watching my show. In 2 hours, it was built. And I looked at it, and it was pretty good. Yeah. First question about AI. Mind you, Claude is a maximalist form of computation that depends on internet access. It uses it uses server farms that are draining water out of marginalized communities in the United States. And it is using labor in the Caribbean and in Latin America to mostly refine it so that it doesn't sound racist and white supremacist, or that it doesn't do child abuse. So you have a lot of underpaid labor in the Caribbean and in Latin America, and here in Southeast Asia, just being exposed to racist language and child pornography and all these things in order to make sure these systems don't replicate that kind of thing, because it was part of the data that they ingested from the ingest from the internet. So the whole point is just to make these systems sound like Ned Flanders. I don't know if any of you seen The Simpsons. So these systems are not particularly, the people who own these systems are, of course, I would say, mostly responsible for the ascent of fascism in the United States and the rebirth of white supremacy and a host of other problems that affect the whole planet. So there I am using Claude Code from within my privileged internet position in New Haven, Connecticut. And in 2 hours, it built the perfect, it wasn't perfect, it built a really good enough digital collection that would work really well in the career. So the first question is, what do we do with that? Considering that in my generation, most of you didn't learn how to write software for culture, for cultural heritage like I did. And I banged that drum for 10 years, and then I got tired of telling people, hey, you should learn how to code. I sounded like an what do we do now when we can probably just have these things? You still need to learn a little bit if you want that thing to come out good. What do we do? I don't know. This is the first question. Second question is the question of ownership, again, of these systems in the way that they represent culture. They are cultural artifacts, not only artifacts that help us write code. Code itself is cultural. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. I was in Ghana last year at a conference of the African Digital Humanities Organization, I want to say, but don't quote me. And I was in a panel on AI and language. And right next to me, I had a colleague, a sociolinguist from Cameroon, and to the other side, I had a corpus linguist from Senegal. And I felt really odd there because I was the only one in the room arguing that we shouldn't digitize everything related to what we could call Creole languages. Over there, they're called mother tongues. The argument the linguists were making to like applause in the room was that this is how we can make those languages survive the 21st century. That if those languages don't become part of the digital ecosystem, that somehow they're endangered. And of course, they use the word endangered too, because you know that Qatar money is sweet. I'll take it. Now, I argued that, and I'm not 100% sure, I argued that perhaps we want to preserve a space that is not visible. A space of opacity, to quote Glissant, which another shared theorist, Edouard Glissant, the theorist, philosopher from Martinique, who always argued for the right to opacity, the right not to be understood, because one of the things he saw was that the Europeans and the Americans with their encyclopedias and their ethnography and all these things felt like they had a right to always understand our inside jokes, to always understand, what did you mean by that? And then, of course, we always found ways to talk in a way that they still wouldn't understand. It wasn't that we were losing that battle. It was that the fact that they had this desire had negative consequences for us. So he was operating at an international level with white people listening to him. And he would say, please stop trying to understand everything we're doing. Try to understand everything we're saying. Try to understand our religious practices. If it means that you're going to then, impose a model of, rationality or universality, that doesn't work for us, on us. So in that sense, I argue that maybe Creole languages, Creole ways of speaking, should not necessarily be a part of these AIs. Now, the argument in reply to that was, well, what if grandma is at home alone and she needs to tell Siri to get an ambulance because she just fell on the ground? And I thought about it, and I didn't answer that way because I already knew that I was the weird guy, light-skinned in Africa. They considered me white there. But I thought, if grandma is alone at home with her phone, we already lost as a community. That's what I wanted to say. I didn't say it. I just said, okay, we have food for thought. Now, I'm going to present it to this room also as food for thought. What do we do? Do we want to be a part of an international ecosystem in which our culture is reflected in the hallucinations of AI? Or shall we preserve a space for ourselves outside? This is the sort of like very... This comes up a lot in these conversations, especially my younger peers love to theorize everything around marronage, a very complex historical phenomenon, right? But these maroon communities would go in and out of the city, but they would keep their own space, right? It's not a bad historical metaphor to describe a sort of practice that allowed communities of people to survive imperialism for centuries. I hope there are no historians in the room that would complicate that for me. I know it's complicated. But the idea for today in the 21st century is the same. Do we want to preserve a space outside of that? And third question, and this is probably the most controversial one. Now I'm hating myself for finishing on this note after, obviously, as if I had not said anything controversial. The question of money. Now, jokingly in Jamaica, last time when I was together with Stanley, I don't remember if he was there standing part of that conversation, but I suggested jokingly that the problem with the way that we have gone about making deals with European companies and American companies for digitizing and creating digital collections is that we just didn't have the right people in the negotiation room. We just had people who got scammed. And they got scammed probably because they didn't understand the tech. They thought it was fancy, want to be a part of technology, whatever. This kind of bullshit language that kind of filters through the political top and the top of companies and boards, where they don't want to sound like idiots, so they use words even though they don't know what they're saying, but nobody's there to check them. So they're like graduate students. They really are faking it until they make it. And of course, if this was the problem, which is made bad deals, maybe the possibility for making good deals is still on the table. Now, this is risky because how the fuck do we control the people who end up in those rooms making those deals with OpenAI and with Microsoft? We have to be really sure that we're sending somebody in there who knows what the hell they're talking about, both on the cultural heritage side of the house and on the technological side of the house. And we need people with that combination of things. Sure, you can bring, sure, but it can only be one, and we need a small army of people in the Caribbean if we are going to be in that monetization game. If we are going to be in the let's make some money, first of all, let me shut down the dreams that we're going to make a lot of money out of this. Now, there's some people in the Caribbean, surely not in Barbados, who think that the cultural heritage is worth a lot more than it is actually worth to these people in terms of what they think they can get out of it. Now, what these people think they can get out of it is consumer products. So the past loses a little bit of its value in consumer products, considering that societies today are mostly presentist, regardless of where you are and what your race is, whether you're white or black, Caribbean or American, it doesn't matter. We live in presentist societies for the most part. Now, that doesn't mean they're worthless, though, and that there are things that we could get out of these deals. I would say the one couple of things that I would ask for is local access, always. Insist on that. Never, ever, ever sign up for anything that would prohibit local access, period. 2, invest in human resources. And I'm just going to stay on those 2, but those will be the highest priorities. You come here, you invest. You can use the data. We give you a license to use the data. You digitize all this stuff, you can use this history. Yeah, I'm done. That was the really good internal timing, because that was my conclusion. As long as we can preserve local access, get a little bit of money for training, to pay for fellowships, students, tuition, to go study with Stanley. I think we can make some deals, or I'll leave it to you as an open question. Can we make deals? Do we trust ourselves to make good deals? Not getting fleeced, like we've been getting fleeced. So with that, I am going to close and open up the space, hopefully, for a little bit of community dreaming, as long as we always keep that practical side in mind, because I am talking about practical things. What do we do going forward? Thank you.